The train from Dublin to Holyhead cut through the Irish countryside like a silver blade, slicing between fields so green they hurt to look at and stone walls that had been standing since before Megan O'Brien's great-grandmother was born. She pressed her forehead against the cool window and watched her homeland blur past, each mile taking her further from everything she'd ever known and closer to a future that felt as uncertain as the weather. In her lap, she held a folder thick with documents, her acceptance letter to Manchester Legal Aid Centre, her lease agreement for a flat she'd only seen in photographs, her train tickets, and beneath it all, like a weight she couldn't shake, the letter from David. She hadn't read it again since that morning 3 weeks ago when she'd found it on her kitchen table next to 2 cups of coffee that had gone cold while she'd stared at his handwriting, trying to make sense of words that rearranged her entire world. Megan, it had begun, and she should have known from that formal address, not Meg, not love, just her full name like she was a client or a stranger, that everything was about to change. I've been thinking about us, about where we're going, and I don't think I can do this anymore. The distance, the different goals, the way we want different things. I think we both deserve to be with someone who wants the same life we do. The rest had been a blur of kind words that felt like knives, explanations that explained nothing, and apologies that somehow made it all worse. He was staying in Dublin. She was leaving for Manchester. The timing wasn't right. Maybe in another life. All the usual phrases people used when they wanted to let someone down easy, as if there were an easy way to have your heart broken. The worst part was that she'd seen it coming. Had felt the distance growing between them for months, not just the physical distance when she'd started spending more time in Manchester for interviews and training, but the emotional distance that came when 2 people realized they were walking toward different horizons. David wanted stability, predictability, a life that looked like his parents' life, steady job, house in the suburbs, children by 30, retirement by 60, death by natural causes in a bed surrounded by grandchildren. Megan wanted more. Something undefined but urgent, something that felt like purpose instead of just existence. The job offer from Manchester Legal Aid had felt like a lifeline, a chance to do work that mattered, to help people who needed help instead of just pushing papers around a law firm that specialized in helping rich people become richer. David had said he was proud of her when she'd gotten the offer, but his eyes had told a different story. His eyes had said goodbye before his mouth caught up. So here she was, 28 years old, single, unemployed in Ireland but employed in England, carrying everything she owned in 2 suitcases and a box of law books, watching the only country she'd ever lived in disappear behind her like a dream she was waking up from. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Siobhan, "Safe travels, love. Call me when you get there. Don't let the English change you." Megan smiled despite herself. Siobhan was 3 years older and had never left County Cork except for holidays, but she was fiercely protective of Megan's Irish identity, as if living in England might somehow dilute her genetic makeup. She'd spent the last month sending Megan articles about Irish expatriates who'd lost their accents or started drinking tea instead of coffee, warning her about the dangers of assimilation. The truth was, Megan was more worried about not fitting in than she was about fitting in too well. She'd grown up in Ballymore, a town small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, where being a O'Brien meant something because her grandfather had been the postmaster and her father was the union representative at the creamery. Moving to Manchester meant starting over as nobody from nowhere, and at 28, that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The ferry crossing was rough, the Irish Sea churning grey-green under a sky that couldn't decide between rain and sun. Megan spent most of it on deck, letting the salt spray sting her face, watching Ireland shrink to a thin line on the horizon and then disappear altogether. By the time they reached Wales, she felt like she'd crossed more than just water, she'd crossed some invisible threshold between who she'd been and who she was becoming. The train from Holyhead to Manchester was crowded with weekend travelers, families returning from holidays, students heading back to university. Megan found herself studying the faces around her, trying to decode the subtle differences between Irish and English expressions, Irish and English clothing, Irish and English ways of moving through the world. Everyone looked foreign and familiar at the same time, like distant relatives she was meeting for the first time. She'd been to Manchester twice before, once for her initial interview, once to look at flats, but both trips had been brief, focused, businesslike. This was different. This was arrival, not visit. This was the beginning of whatever came next. The city revealed itself gradually as the train pulled into Manchester Piccadilly. First the industrial outskirts with their red brick mills and converted warehouses, then the gleaming office towers of the city centre, then the Victorian railway arches that spoke of an older, grander Manchester built on cotton and coal and the labour of people who'd never seen the profits their work generated. Meghan had chosen Manchester partly because of its history, because it was a city built by working people, a place where someone like her might fit in. Her new flat was in what the estate agent had called a transitional neighbourhood, a euphemism, she'd learned, for formerly working class, currently being gentrified, and nobody's quite sure what it will become. The taxi from the station wound through streets that seemed to shift character every few blocks. Here was a row of traditional pubs with names like the King's Arms and the Rose and Crown. There was a street lined with Somali restaurants and Pakistani groceries. Here was a block of gleaming new apartments with names like the Metropolitan and Riverside Quay. There was a corner where teenagers in tracksuits clustered around a fried chicken shop, their laughter echoing off buildings that looked like they'd been standing since Queen Victoria was on the throne. "First time in Manchester?" the taxi driver asked, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. His accent was pure Mancunian, thick and musical. "Yes," Meghan said. "Moving here for work." "What kind of work?" "Legal aid. Helping people who can't afford lawyers." He nodded approvingly. "Good on you. City needs more people willing to help instead of just looking to get rich." "Where you from originally?" "Ireland. County Cork." "Ah, right. You'll find plenty of Irish here. Been coming over for work since before my grandfather's time. Your lot built half the city, you know." Meghan felt something ease in her chest. Maybe she wouldn't be as much of an outsider as she'd feared. The Merchant Quarter, where her new building was located, sat at the intersection of Manchester's industrial past and its uncertain future. The streets were cobblestoned, lined with Victorian warehouses that had been converted into loft apartments, art galleries, and trendy restaurants with names like Fabric and the Loading Dock. But there were still traces of the neighborhood's working-class roots: a traditional butcher shop, a laundrette that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, a pub called the Dockers Arms where old men in flat caps sat in the windows watching the world change around them. Her building, Millfield Warehouse, was a 6-story brick structure that had once stored textiles bound for markets around the British Empire. Now it housed 36 flats, each one carved out of what had been vast, open storage floors. The estate agent had made much of the original features: exposed brick walls, cast iron columns, windows large enough to drive a car through. What he hadn't mentioned was that the conversion had been done on the cheap, with thin walls that let every sound pass through and heating systems that seemed to have been designed by someone who'd never experienced a Manchester winter. Flat 2C was on the second floor, facing the courtyard rather than the street. It was small, just a studio with a separate bathroom and a kitchen that was really just a counter with appliances lined up against one wall. But it was hers, paid for with her own salary, and after sharing flats with roommates through most of her 20s, the privacy felt luxurious. The previous tenant had left it clean but impersonal, all white walls and beige carpet. Meghan spent her first evening unpacking her books, trying to make the space feel like home. She arranged her law texts on the bookshelf that had been built into one of the original brick arches, hung her Irish landscapes on the walls, and set up her laptop on the small table by the window where she could look out into the courtyard and watch the seasons change. It wasn't until she was making tea in her tiny kitchen that the loneliness hit her. In Dublin, she would have called Siobhan or dropped by her parents' house or met friends at their usual pub. Here, she knew no one. The silence of the flat was absolute, broken only by the sound of traffic from the street and the occasional murmur of voices from neighboring flats. She called Siobhan, needing to hear a familiar voice. "How is it?" her sister asked immediately. "Different," Meghan said. "Bigger than I expected, but also smaller, if that makes sense." "The flat's lovely, though. Very modern." "Modern how?" "Like, no character." Meghan laughed. "No, it has character. It's in an old warehouse, all exposed brick and big windows. But everything's been renovated, so it's got modern appliances and proper heating and all that." "Sounds posh." "It's not posh, exactly. Just clean, professional. Like the kind of place where people have careers instead of just jobs." There was a pause. "You have a career, Meg." "I know. I just meant, Megan struggled to put it into words. It feels like a place where I need to be the person I want to become, not the person I've always been. Don't go getting ideas above your station, Siobhan said, but her tone was fond. You're still a girl from Ballymore, no matter how fancy your flat is. After they hung up, Megan sat by her window watching lights come on in the flats across the courtyard. She could see glimpses of other people's lives, a woman cooking dinner while talking on the phone, a man at a computer, two people sharing a bottle of wine on a small balcony. Everyone looked settled, established, like they belonged exactly where they were. Tomorrow she would start work, would begin the process of building a new life. Tonight, she was just a stranger in a strange place, looking out at a city that didn't yet know her name. Chapter 2, First Days. Manchester Legal Aid Centre occupied the ground floor of a converted mill in the northern quarter, a part of the city that had been industrial, then derelict, then artistic, and was now somewhere between trendy and trying too hard. The building's red brick walls were covered with murals and street art, and the narrow streets were lined with vintage shops, independent coffee roasters, and bars that didn't open until after dark. Megan arrived at 8:30 on her first Monday morning, 30 minutes early because she'd miscalculated the tram journey and hadn't wanted to be late. She stood outside the building for a few minutes, reading the signs in the windows: immigration advice, housing rights, debt counseling, domestic violence support, and feeling a mixture of excitement and terror. This was what she'd wanted, work that mattered, but now that she was here, the responsibility felt enormous. The reception area was cramped and bustling, even at this early hour. Plastic chairs were arranged in rows facing a desk where a young woman with purple hair was fielding phone calls in 3 different languages. Clients waited with varying degrees of patience, some reading newspapers, some staring at their phones, some just staring at nothing with the particular exhaustion that came from dealing with problems that felt insurmountable. "You must be Megan," a voice said behind her. She turned to see a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of sensible shoes that said she spent her days on her feet. "I'm Janet Morrison, office manager. Welcome to the madhouse." Janet led her through a maze of cubicles and small offices, pointing out the coffee machine: "It's terrible, but it's free. The photocopier: it jams constantly, but if you hit it right here, it usually unjams, and the filing system: don't ask me to explain it, just learn where things go and put them there." The legal aid office was nothing like the corporate law firm where Megan had worked in Dublin. There, everything had been sleek and quiet, all glass and steel, and the kind of hush that came from charging €800 an hour. Here, everything was organized chaos, phones ringing constantly, lawyers shouting questions to each other across cubicle walls, the constant hum of human need pressing against insufficient resources. "Your office is here," Janet said, stopping in front of a cubicle that was slightly larger than the others. "Office is a generous term, I know, but you get a window and a filing cabinet, which makes you practically executive level around here." The window looked out onto a narrow alley where delivery trucks unloaded supplies for the restaurants and shops on the main street. Not exactly a view, but natural light, which Megan was beginning to understand was a luxury in the building. "Your supervisor is Maria Santos," Janet continued. "She's in court this morning, but she'll be back after lunch to get you oriented. For now, I'll introduce you to the team and let you get settled." The team consisted of 6 lawyers, 3 paralegals, 2 social workers, and an administrator who also served as translator for clients who spoke Arabic. Everyone was younger than Megan had expected.